Allatoona, being an important place, was strongly entrenched for occupation by our troops before advancing farther, and made a secondary base of supplies. The railroad was finished up to that point, the entrenchments completed, storehouses provided for food, and the army got in readiness for a further advance. The rains, however, were falling in such torrents that it was impossible to move the army by the side roads which they would have to move upon in order to turn Johnston out of his new position. While Sherman's army lay here, General F.P. Blair returned to it, bringing with him the 2 divisions of veterans who had been on furlough. Johnston had fallen back to Marietta and Kennesaw Mountain, where strong entrenchments awaited him. At this latter place, our troops made an assault upon the enemy's lines, after having got their own lines up close to him, and failed, sustaining considerable loss. But during the progress of the battle, Schofield was gaining ground to the left, and the cavalry on his left were gaining still more toward the enemy's rear. These operations were completed by the 3rd of July, when it was found that Johnston had evacuated the place. He was pursued at once. Sherman had made every preparation to abandon the railroad, leaving a strong guard in his entrenchments. He had intended moving out with 20 days' rations and plenty of ammunition to come in on the railroad again at the Chattahoochee River. Johnston frustrated this plan by himself, starting back as above stated. This time he fell back to the Chattahoochee. About the 5th of July he was besieged again, Sherman getting easy possession of the Chattahoochee River both above and below him. The enemy was again flanked out of his position, or so frightened by flanking movements that on the night of the 20th he fell back across the river. Here Johnston made a stand until the 17th, when Sherman's old tactics prevailed again, and the final movement toward Atlanta began. Johnston was now relieved of the command, and Hood superseded him. Johnston's tactics in this campaign do not seem to have met with much favour, either in the eyes of the administration at Richmond or of the people of that section of the South in which he was commanding. The very fact of a change of commanders being ordered under such circumstances was an indication of a change of policy, and that now they would become the aggressors, the very thing our troops wanted. For my own part, I think that Johnston's tactics were right. Anything that could have prolonged the war a year beyond the time that it did finally close would probably have exhausted the North to such an extent that they might then have abandoned the contest and agreed to a separation. Atlanta was very strongly entrenched all the way around in a circle about 1.5 miles outside of the city. In addition to this, there were advanced entrenchments which had to be taken before a close siege could be commenced. Sure enough, as indicated by the change of commanders, the enemy was about to assume the offensive. On the 20th, he came out and attacked the Army of the Cumberland most furiously. Hooker's corps and Newton's and Johnson's divisions were the principal ones engaged in this contest, which lasted more than an hour, but the Confederates were then forced to fall back inside their main lines. The losses were quite heavy on both sides. On this day, General Gresham, since our Postmaster General, was very badly wounded. During the night, Hood abandoned his outer lines, and our troops were advanced. The investment had not been relinquished for a moment during the day. During the night of the 21st, Hood moved out again, passing by our left flank, which was then in motion to get a position farther in rear of him, and a desperate battle ensued, which lasted most of the day of the 22nd. At first, the battle went very much in favour of the Confederates, our troops being somewhat surprised. While our troops were advancing, they were struck in flank, and their flank was enveloped. But they had become too thorough veterans to be thrown into irreparable confusion by an unexpected attack when off their guard, and soon they were in order and engaging the enemy, with the advantage now of knowing where their antagonist was. The field of battle continued to expand until it embraced about 7 miles of ground. Finally, however, and before night, the enemy was driven back into the city. It was during this battle that McPherson, while passing from one column to another, was instantly killed. In his death, the army lost one of its ablest, purest, and best generals. Garrard had been sent out with his cavalry to get upon the railroad east of Atlanta, and to cut it in the direction of Augusta. He was successful in this and returned about the time of the battle. Rousseau had also come up from Tennessee with a small division of cavalry, having crossed the Tennessee River about Decatur and made a raid into Alabama. Finally, when hard pressed, he had come in, striking the railroad in rear of Sherman, and reported to him about this time. The Battle of the 22nd is usually known as the Battle of Atlanta, although the city did not fall into our hands until the 2nd of September. Preparations went on, as before, to flank the enemy out of his position. The work was tedious, and the lines that had to be maintained were very long. Our troops were gradually worked around to the east until they struck the road between Decatur and Atlanta. These lines were strongly fortified, as were those to the north and west of the city, all as close up to the enemy's lines as practicable, in order to hold them with the smallest possible number of men, the design being to detach an army to move by our right and try to get upon the railroad down south of Atlanta. On the 27th, the movement by the right flank commenced. On the 28th, the enemy struck our right flank, General Logan commanding, with great vigour. Logan entrenched himself hastily, and by that means was enabled to resist all assaults and inflict a great deal of damage upon the enemy. These assaults were continued to the middle of the afternoon and resumed once or twice still later in the day. The enemy's losses in these unsuccessful assaults were fearful. During that evening, the enemy in Logan's front withdrew into the town. This now left Sherman's army close up to the Confederate lines, extending from a point directly east of the city around by the north and west of it for a distance of fully 10 miles. The whole of this line being entrenched and made stronger every day they remained there. In the latter part of July, Sherman sent Stoneman to destroy the railroads to the south, about Macon. He was then to go east and, if possible, release our prisoners about Andersonville. There were painful stories current at the time about the great hardships these prisoners had to endure in the way of general bad treatment, in the way in which they were housed, and in the way in which they were fed. Great sympathy was felt for them, and it was thought that even if they could be turned loose upon the country it would be a great relief to them. But the attempt proved a failure. McCook, who commanded a small brigade, was first reported to have been captured, but he got back, having inflicted a good deal of damage upon the enemy. He had also taken some prisoners, but encountering afterwards a largely superior force of the enemy, he was obliged to drop his prisoners and get back as best he could with what men he had left. He had lost several hundred men out of his small command. On the 4th of August, Colonel Adams, commanding a little brigade of about 1,000 men, returned reporting Stoneman and all but himself as lost. I myself had heard around Richmond of the capture of Stoneman and had sent Sherman word, which he received. The rumour was confirmed there also from other sources. A few days after Colonel Adams's return, Colonel Capron also got in with a small detachment and confirmed the report of the capture of Stoneman with something less than 1,000 men. It seems that Stoneman, finding the escape of all his force was impossible, had made arrangements for the escape of 2 divisions. He covered the movement of these divisions to the rear with a force of about 700 men, and at length surrendered himself and this detachment to the commanding Confederate. In this raid, however, much damage was inflicted upon the enemy by the destruction of cars, locomotives, army wagons, manufactories of military supplies, etc. On the 4th and 5th, Sherman endeavoured to get upon the railroad to our right, where Schofield was in command, but these attempts failed utterly. General Palmer was charged with being the cause of this failure, to a great extent, by both General Sherman and General Schofield, but I am not prepared to say this, although a question seems to have arisen with Palmer as to whether Schofield had any right to command him. If he did raise this question while an action was going on, that act alone was exceedingly reprehensible. About the same time, Wheeler got upon our railroad north of Resaca and destroyed it nearly up to Dalton. This cut Sherman off from communication with the north for several days. Sherman responded to this attack on his lines of communication by directing one upon theirs. Kilpatrick started on the night of the 18th of August to reach the Macon Road about Jonesboro. He succeeded in doing so, passed entirely around the Confederate lines of Atlanta, and was back again in his former position on our left by the 22nd. These little affairs, however, contributed but very little to the grand result. They annoyed, it is true, but any damage thus done to a railroad by any cavalry expedition is soon repaired. Sherman made preparations for a repetition of his tactics, that is, for a flank movement with as large a force as could be got together to some point in the enemy's rear. Sherman commenced this last movement on the 25th of August, and on the 1st of September was well up towards the railroad 20 miles south of Atlanta. Here he found Hardee entrenched, ready to meet him. A battle ensued, but he was unable to drive Hardee away before night set in. Under cover of the night, however, Hardee left of his own accord. That night Hood blew up his military works, such as he thought would be valuable in our hands, and decamped. The next morning at daylight, General H.W. Slocum, who was commanding north of the city, moved in and took possession of Atlanta and notified Sherman. Sherman then moved deliberately back, taking 3 days to reach the city, and occupied a line extending from Decatur on the left to Atlanta in the center, with his troops extending out of the city for some distance to the right. The campaign had lasted about 4 months and was one of the most memorable in history. There was but little, if anything, in the whole campaign, now that it is over, to criticize at all, and nothing to criticize severely. It was creditable alike to the general who commanded and the army which had executed it. Sherman had on this campaign some bright, wide-awake division and brigade commanders whose alertness added a host to the efficiency of his command. The troops now went to work to make themselves comfortable and to enjoy a little rest after their arduous campaign. The city of Atlanta was turned into a military base. The citizens were all compelled to leave. Sherman also very wisely prohibited the assembling of the army of sutlers and traders, who always follow in the wake of an army in the field, if permitted to do so, from trading with the citizens and getting the money of the soldiers for articles of but little use to them, and for which they are made to pay most exorbitant prices. He limited the number of these traders to 1 for each of his 3 armies. The news of Sherman's success reached the North instantaneously and set the country all aglow. This was the first great political campaign for the Republicans in their canvass of 1864. It was followed later by Sheridan's campaign in the Shenandoah Valley, and these 2 campaigns probably had more effect in settling the election of the following November than all the speeches, all the bonfires, and all the parading with banners and bands of music in the North. Chapter 51. Grand Movement of the Army of the Potomac, crossing the Rapidan, entering the Wilderness, Battle of the Wilderness. Soon after midnight, May 3rd, 4th, the Army of the Potomac moved out from its position north of the Rapidan to embark upon that memorable campaign destined to result in the capture of the Confederate capital and the army defending it. This was not to be accomplished, however, without as desperate fighting as the world has ever witnessed, not to be consummated in a day, a week, a month, or a single season. The losses inflicted and endured were destined to be severe. But the armies now confronting each other had already been in deadly conflict for a period of 3 years, with immense losses in killed, by death from sickness, captured, and wounded, and neither had made any real progress toward accomplishing the final end. It is true the Confederates had so far held their capital, and they claimed this to be their sole object. But previously they had boldly proclaimed their intention to capture Philadelphia, New York, and the national capital, and had made several attempts to do so, and once or twice had come fearfully near making their boast good, too near for complacent contemplation by the loyal North. They had also come near losing their own capital on at least one occasion. So here was a standoff. The campaign now begun was destined to result in heavier losses to both armies in a given time than any previously suffered, but the carnage was to be limited to a single year and to accomplish all that had been anticipated or desired at the beginning in that time. We had to have hard fighting to achieve this. The 2 armies had been confronting each other so long, without any decisive result, that they hardly knew which could whip. 10 days' rations with a supply of forage and ammunition were taken in wagons. Beef cattle were driven with the trains and butchered as wanted. 3 days' rations in addition, in haversacks, and 50 rounds of cartridges were carried on the person of each soldier. The country over which the army had to operate, from the Rapidan to the crossing of the James River, is rather flat and is cut by numerous streams which make their way to the Chesapeake Bay. The crossings of these streams by the army were generally made not far above tide water, and where they formed a considerable obstacle to the rapid advance of troops even when the enemy did not appear in opposition. The country roads were narrow and poor. Most of the country is covered with a dense forest, in places, like the Wilderness and along the Chickahominy, almost impenetrable even for infantry except along the roads. All bridges were naturally destroyed before the national troops came to them. The Army of the Potomac was composed of 3 infantry and 1 cavalry corps, commanded respectively by Generals W. S. Hancock, G. K. Warren, John Sedgwick, and P. H. Sheridan. The artillery was commanded by General Henry J. Hunt. This arm was in such abundance that the fourth of it could not be used to advantage in such a country as we were destined to pass through. The surplus was much in the way, taking up as it did so much of the narrow and bad roads, and consuming so much of the forage and other stores brought up by the trains. The 5th Corps, General Warren commanding, was in advance on the right, and marched directly for Germania Ford, preceded by 1 division of cavalry under General J. H. Wilson. General Sedgwick followed Warren with the 6th Corps. Germania Ford was 9 or 10 miles below the right of Lee's line. Hancock, with the 2nd Corps, moved by another road, farther east, directly upon Ely's Ford, 6 miles below Germania, preceded by Gregg's division of cavalry, and followed by the artillery. Torbert's division of cavalry was left north of the Rapidan, for the time to picket the river and prevent the enemy from crossing and getting into our rear. The cavalry seized the 2 crossings before daylight, drove the enemy's pickets guarding them away, and by 6 o'clock a.m. had the pontoons laid ready for the crossing of the infantry and artillery. This was undoubtedly a surprise to Lee. The fact that the movement was unopposed proves this. Burnside, with the 9th Corps, was left back at Warrenton, guarding the railroad from Bull Run forward to preserve control of it in case our crossing the Rapidan should be long delayed. He was instructed, however, to advance at once on receiving notice that the army had crossed, and a dispatch was sent to him a little after 1 p.m., giving the information that our crossing had been successful. The country was heavily wooded at all the points of crossing, particularly on the south side of the river. The battlefield from the crossing of the Rapidan until the final movement from the Wilderness towards Spotsylvania was of the same character. There were some clearings and small farms within what might be termed the battlefield, but generally the country was covered with a dense forest. The roads were narrow and bad. All the conditions were favourable for defensive operations. There are 2 roads, good for that part of Virginia, running from Orange Court House to the battlefield. The most southerly of these roads is known as the Orange Court House Plank Road, the northern one as the Orange Turnpike. There are also roads from east of the battlefield running to Spotsylvania Courthouse, one from Chancellorsville, branching at Aldrich's. The western branch going by Piney Branch Church, Allsops, thence by the Brock Road to Spotsylvania. The east branch goes by Gates's, thence to Spotsylvania. The Brock Road runs from Germania Ford through the battlefield and on to the courthouse. As Spotsylvania is approached, the country is cut up with numerous roads, some going to the town direct, and others crossing so as to connect the farms with roads going there. Lee's headquarters were at Orange Courthouse. From there to Fredericksburg he had the use of the 2 roads above described running nearly parallel to the Wilderness. This gave him unusual facilities, for that country, for concentrating his forces to his right. These roads strike the road from Germania Ford in the Wilderness. As soon as the crossing of the infantry was assured, the cavalry pushed forward, Wilson's division by Wilderness Tavern to Parker's Store on the Orange Plank Road, Gregg to the left towards Chancellorsville. Warren followed Wilson and reached the Wilderness Tavern by noon, took position there and entrenched. Sedgwick followed Warren. He was across the river and in camp on the south bank, on the right of Warren, by sundown. Hancock, with the Tude Corps, moved parallel with Warren and camped about 6 miles east of him. Before night, all the troops, and by the evening of the 5th, the trains of more than 4,000 wagons, were safely on the south side of the river. There never was a corps better organised than was the Quartermaster's Corps with the Army of the Potomac in 1864. With a wagon train that would have extended from the Rapidan to Richmond, stretched along in single file and separated as the teams necessarily would be when moving, we could still carry only 3 days' forage and about 10 to 12 days' rations, besides a supply of ammunition. To overcome all difficulties, the Chief Quartermaster, General Rufus Ingalls, had marked on each wagon the corps badge with the division colour and the number of the brigade. At a glance, the particular brigade to which any wagon belonged could be told. The wagons were also marked to note the contents: if ammunition, whether for artillery or infantry; if forage, whether grain or hay; if rations, whether bread, pork, beans, rice, sugar, coffee, or whatever it might be. Empty wagons were never allowed to follow the army or stay in camp. As soon as a wagon was empty, it would return to the base of supply for a load of precisely the same article that had been taken from it. Empty trains were obliged to leave the road free for loaded ones. Arriving near the army, they would be parked in fields nearest to the brigades they belonged to. Issues, except of ammunition, were made at night in all cases. By this system, the hauling of forage for the supply train was almost wholly dispensed with. They consumed theirs at the depots. I left Culpeper Courthouse after all the troops had been put in motion, and passing rapidly to the front, crossed the Rapidan in advance of Sedgwick's corps, and established headquarters for the afternoon and night in a deserted house near the river. Orders had been given, long before this movement began, to cut down the baggage of officers and men to the lowest point possible. Notwithstanding this, I saw scattered along the road from Culpeper to Germania 4 wagon loads of new blankets and overcoats, thrown away by the troops to lighten their knapsacks, an improvidence I had never witnessed before. Lee, while his pickets and signal corps must have discovered at a very early hour on the morning of the 4th of May that the Army of the Potomac was moving, evidently did not learn until about 1 o'clock in the afternoon by what route we would confront his army. This I judge from the fact that at 1:15 p.m., an hour and a quarter after Warren had reached Old Wilderness Tavern, our officers took off rebel signals which, when translated, were seen to be an order to his troops to occupy their entrenchments at Mine Run. Here at night, dispatches were received announcing that Sherman, Butler, and Crook had moved according to programme. On discovering the advance of the Army of the Potomac, Lee ordered Hill, Ewell, and Longstreet, each commanding corps, to move to the right to attack us, Hill on the Orange Plank Road, Longstreet to follow on the same road. Longstreet was at this time, middle of the afternoon, at Gordonsville, 20 or more miles away. Ewell was ordered by the Orange Pike. He was nearby and arrived some 4 miles east of Mine Run before bivouacking for the night. My orders were given through General Meade for an early advance on the morning of the 5th. Warren was to move to Parker's Store, and Wilson's cavalry, then at Parker's Store, to move on to Craig's meeting house. Sedgwick followed Warren, closing in on his right. The Army of the Potomac was facing to the west, though our advance was made to the south, except when facing the enemy. Hancock was to move southwestward to join on the left of Warren, his left to reach to Shady Grove Church. At 6 o'clock, before reaching Parker's Store, Warren discovered the enemy. He sent word back to this effect, and was ordered to halt and prepare to meet and attack him. Wright, with his division, of Sedgwick's corps, was ordered, by any road he could find, to join on to Warren's right, and Getty with his division, also of Sedgwick's corps, was ordered to move rapidly by Warren's rear and get on his left. This was the speediest way to reinforce Warren, who was confronting the enemy on both the Orange Plank and Turnpike roads. Burnside had moved promptly on the 4th, on receiving word that the Army of the Potomac had safely crossed the Rapidan. By making a night march, although some of his troops had to march 40 miles to reach the river, he was crossing with the head of his column early on the morning of the 5th. Meade moved his headquarters onto Old Wilderness Tavern, 4 miles south of the river, as soon as it was light enough to see the road. I remained to hasten Burnside's crossing and to put him in position. Burnside at this time was not under Meade's command and was his senior in rank. Getting information of the proximity of the enemy, I informed Meade, and without waiting to see Burnside, at once moved forward my headquarters to where Meade was. It was my plan then, as it was on all other occasions, to take the initiative whenever the enemy could be drawn from his entrenchments if we were not entrenched ourselves. Warren had not yet reached the point where he was to halt when he discovered the enemy nearby. Neither party had any advantage of position. Warren was, therefore, ordered to attack as soon as he could prepare for it. At 9 o'clock, Hancock was ordered to come up to the support of Getty. He himself arrived at Getty's front about noon, but his troops were yet far in the rear. Getty was directed to hold his position at all hazards until relieved. About this hour, Warren was ready, and attacked with favourable though not decisive results. Getty was somewhat isolated from Warren, and was in a precarious condition for a time. Wilson, with his division of cavalry, was farther south, and was cut off from the rest of the army. At 2 o'clock, Hancock's troops began to arrive, and immediately he was ordered to join Getty and attack the enemy. But the heavy timber and narrow roads prevented him from getting into position for attack as promptly as he generally did when receiving such orders. At 4 o'clock he again received his orders to attack, and General Getty received orders from Meade a few minutes later to attack whether Hancock was ready or not. He met the enemy under Heth within a few hundred yards. Hancock immediately sent 2 divisions, commanded by Birney and Mott, and later 2 brigades, Carroll's and Owen's, to the support of Getty. This was timely and saved Getty. During the battle, Getty and Carroll were wounded, but remained on the field. One of Birney's most gallant brigade commanders, Alexander Hayes, was killed. I had been at West Point with Hayes for 3 years, and had served with him through the Mexican War, a portion of the time in the same regiment. He was a most gallant officer, ready to lead his command wherever ordered. With him it was, "Come, boys, not go." Wadsworth's division and Baxter's brigade of the 2D Division were sent to reinforce Hancock and Getty, but the density of the intervening forest was such that, there being no road to march upon, they did not get up with the head of column until night, and bivouacked where they were without getting into position. During the afternoon, Sheridan sent Gregg's division of cavalry to Todd's Tavern in search of Wilson. This was fortunate. He found Wilson engaged with a superior force under General Rosser, supported by infantry, and falling back before it. Together they were strong enough to turn the tables upon the enemy and themselves become aggressive. They soon drove the rebel cavalry back beyond Corbin's Bridge. Fighting between Hancock and Hill continued until night put a close to it. Neither side made any special progress. After the close of the Battle of the 5th of May, my orders were given for the following morning. We knew Longstreet with 12,000 men was on his way to join Hill's right near the Brock Road, and might arrive during the night. I was anxious that the rebels should not take the initiative in the morning, and therefore ordered Hancock to make an assault at 4:30 o'clock. Meade asked to have the hour changed to 6. Deferring to his wishes as far as I was willing, the order was modified, and 5 was fixed as the hour to move. Hancock had now fully 1/2 of the Army of the Potomac. Wadsworth, with his division, which had arrived the night before, lay in a line perpendicular to that held by Hill, and to the right of Hancock. He was directed to move at the same time, and to attack Hill's left. Burnside, who was coming up with 2 divisions, was directed to get in between Warren and Wadsworth, and attack as soon as he could get in position to do so. Sedgwick and Warren were to make attacks in their front, to detain as many of the enemy as they could, and to take advantage of any attempt to reinforce Hill from that quarter. Burnside was ordered, if he should succeed in breaking the enemy's centre, to swing around to the left and envelop the right of Lee's army. Hancock was informed of all the movements ordered. Burnside had 3 divisions, but one of them, a coloured division, was sent to guard the wagon train, and he did not see it again until July. Lee was evidently very anxious that there should be no battle on his right until Longstreet got up. This is evident from the fact that notwithstanding the early hour at which I had ordered the assault, both for the purpose of being the attacking party and to strike before Longstreet got up, Lee was ahead in his assault on our right. His purpose was evident, but he failed. Hancock was ready to advance by the hour named, but learning in time that Longstreet was moving a part of his corps by the Catharpin Road, thus threatening his left flank, sent a division of infantry, commanded by General Barlow, with all his artillery, to cover the approaches by which Longstreet was expected. This disposition was made in time to attack as ordered. Hancock moved by the left of the Orange Plank Road, and Wadsworth by the right of it. The fighting was desperate for about an hour, when the enemy began to break up in great confusion. I believed then, and see no reason to change that opinion now, that if the country had been such that Hancock and his command could have seen the confusion and panic in the lines of the enemy, it would have been taken advantage of so effectually that Lee would not have made another stand outside of his Richmond defences. Gibbon commanded Hancock's left, and was ordered to attack, but was not able to accomplish much. On the morning of the 6th, Sheridan was sent to connect with Hancock's left and attack the enemy's cavalry, who were trying to get on our left and rear. He met them at the intersection of the Furnace and Brock roads and at Todd's Tavern, and defeated them at both places. Later he was attacked, and again the enemy was repulsed. Hancock heard the firing between Sheridan and Stuart, and thinking the enemy coming by that road, still further reinforced his position guarding the entrance to the Brock Road. Another incident happened during the day to further induce Hancock to weaken his attacking column. Word reached him that troops were seen moving towards him from the direction of Todd's Tavern, and Brooks' brigade was detached to meet this new enemy. But the troops approaching proved to be several hundred convalescents coming from Chancellorsville, by the road Hancock had advanced upon, to join their respective commands. At 6:50 a.m., Burnside, who had passed Wilderness Tavern at 6 o'clock, was ordered to send a division to the support of Hancock, but to continue with the remainder of his command in the execution of his previous order. The difficulty of making a way through the dense forests prevented Burnside from getting up in time to be of any service on the forenoon of the 6th. Hancock followed Hill's retreating forces in the morning a mile or more. He maintained this position until, along in the afternoon, Longstreet came upon him. The retreating column of Hill meeting reinforcements that had not yet been engaged became encouraged and returned with them. They were enabled, from the density of the forest, to approach within a few hundred yards of our advance before being discovered. Falling upon a brigade of Hancock's corps thrown to the advance, they swept it away almost instantly. The enemy followed up his advantage, and soon came upon Mott's division, which fell back in great confusion. Hancock made dispositions to hold his advanced position, but after holding it for a time, fell back into the position that he had held in the morning, which was strongly entrenched. In this engagement the intrepid Wadsworth, while trying to rally his men, was mortally wounded and fell into the hands of the enemy. The enemy followed up, but made no immediate attack. The Confederate General Jenkins was killed, and Longstreet seriously wounded in this engagement. Longstreet had to leave the field, not to resume command for many weeks. His loss was a severe one to Lee, and compensated in a great measure for the mishap or misapprehensions which had fallen to our lot during the day. After Longstreet's removal from the field, Lee took command of his right in person. He was not able, however, to rally his men to attack Hancock's position, and withdrew from our front for the purpose of reforming. Hancock sent a brigade to clear his front of all remnants that might be left of Longstreet's or Hill's commands. This brigade, having been formed at right angles to the entrenchments held by Hancock's command, swept down the whole length of them from left to right. A brigade of the enemy was encountered in this move, but it broke and disappeared without a contest. Firing was continued after this, but with less fury. Burnside had not yet been able to get up to render any assistance, but it was now only about 9 in the morning, and he was getting into position on Hancock's right. At 4:15 in the afternoon, Lee attacked our left. His line moved up to within 100 yards of ours and opened a heavy fire. This status was maintained for about half an hour. Then a part of Mott's division and Ward's brigade of Birney's division gave way and retired in disorder. The enemy under R.H. Anderson took advantage of this and pushed through our line, planting their flags on a part of the entrenchments not on fire. But owing to the efforts of Hancock, their success was but temporary. Carroll, of Gibbon's division, moved at a double quick with his brigade and drove back the enemy, inflicting great loss. Fighting had continued from 5 in the morning, sometimes along the whole line, at other times only in places. The ground fought over had varied in width, but averaged 3/4 of a mile. The killed, and many of the severely wounded, of both armies lay within this belt where it was impossible to reach them. The woods were set on fire by the bursting shells, and the conflagration raged. The wounded who had not strength to move themselves were either suffocated or burned to death. Finally, the fire communicated with our breastworks, in places. Being constructed of wood, they burned with great fury. But the battle still raged, our men firing through the flames until it became too hot to remain longer. Lee was now in distress. His men were in confusion, and his personal efforts failed to restore order. These facts, however, were learned subsequently, or we would have taken advantage of his condition and no doubt gained a decisive success. His troops were withdrawn now, but I revoked the order which I had given previously to this assault, for Hancock to attack because his troops had exhausted their ammunition and did not have time to replenish from the train, which was at some distance. Burnside, Sedgwick, and Warren had all kept up an assault during all this time, but their efforts had no other effect than to prevent the enemy from reinforcing his right from the troops in their front. I had, on the 5th, ordered all the bridges over the Rapidan to be taken up except one at Germania Ford. The troops on Sedgwick's right had been sent to reinforce our left. This left our right in danger of being turned, and us of being cut off from all present bases of supplies. Sedgwick had refused his right and entrenched it for protection against attack. But late in the afternoon of the 6th, Early came out from his lines in considerable force and got in upon Sedgwick's right, notwithstanding the precautions taken, and created considerable confusion. Early captured several hundred prisoners, among them 2 general officers. The defence, however, was vigorous, and night coming on, the enemy was thrown into as much confusion as our troops engaged were. Early says in his Memoirs that if we had discovered the confusion in his lines, we might have brought fresh troops to his great discomfort. Many officers, who had not been attacked by Early, continued coming to my headquarters even after Sedgwick had rectified his lines a little farther to the rear, with news of the disaster, fully impressed with the idea that the enemy was pushing on and would soon be upon me. During the night, all of Lee's army withdrew within their entrenchments. On the morning of the 7th, General Custer drove the enemy's cavalry from Catharpin Furnace to Todd's Tavern. Pickets and skirmishers were sent along our entire front to find the position of the enemy. Some went as far as 1.5 miles before finding him. But Lee showed no disposition to come out of his works. There was no battle during the day, and but little firing except in Warren's front, he being directed about noon to make a reconnaissance in force. This drew some sharp firing, but there was no attempt on the part of Lee to drive him back. This ended the Battle of the Wilderness. No desperate fighting has been witnessed on this continent than that of the 5th and 6th of May. Our victory consisted in having successfully crossed a formidable stream, almost in the face of an enemy, and in getting the army together as a unit. We gained an advantage on the morning of the 6th, which, if it had been followed up, must have proven very decisive. In the evening the enemy gained an advantage, but was speedily repulsed. As we stood at the close, the 2 armies were relatively in about the same condition to meet each other as when the river divided them. But the fact of having safely crossed was a victory. Our losses in the wilderness were very severe. Those of the Confederates must have been even more so, but I have no means of speaking with accuracy upon this point. The Germania Ford Bridge was transferred to Ely's Ford to facilitate the transportation of the wounded to Washington. It may be as well here as elsewhere to state two things connected with all movements of the Army of the Potomac. First, in every change of position or halt for the night, whether confronting the enemy or not, the moment arms were stacked, the men entrenched themselves. For this purpose, they would build up piles of logs or rails if they could be found in their front, and dig a ditch, throwing the dirt forward on the timber. Thus, the digging they did counted in making a depression to stand in, and increased the elevation in front of them. It was wonderful how quickly they could in this way construct defences of considerable strength. When a halt was made with the view of assaulting the enemy, or in his presence, these would be strengthened, or their positions changed under the direction of engineer officers. The second was the use made of the telegraph and signal corps. Nothing could be more complete than the organisation and discipline of this body of brave and intelligent men. Insulated wires, insulated so that they would transmit messages in a storm, on the ground or under water, were wound upon reels, making about 200 pounds weight of wire to each reel. 2 men and 1 mule were detailed to each reel. The pack saddle on which this was carried was provided with a rack like a sawbuck placed crosswise of the saddle and raised above it so that the reel, with its wire, would revolve freely. There was a wagon, supplied with a telegraph operator, battery and telegraph instruments for each division, each corps, each army, and one for my headquarters. There were wagons also loaded with light poles, about the size and length of a wall tent pole, supplied with an iron spike in one end, used to hold the wires up when laid, so that wagons and artillery would not run over them. The mules thus loaded were assigned to brigades and always kept with the command they were assigned to. The operators were also assigned to particular headquarters, and never changed except by special orders. The moment the troops were put in position to go into camp, all the men connected with this branch of service would proceed to put up their wires. A mule loaded with a coil of wire would be led to the rear of the nearest flank of the brigade he belonged to, and would be led in a line parallel thereto, while one man would hold an end of the wire and uncoil it as the mule was led off. When he had walked the length of the wire, the whole of it would be on the ground. This would be done in rear of every brigade at the same time. The ends of all the wires would then be joined, making a continuous wire in the rear of the whole army. The men, attached to brigades or divisions, would all commence at once raising the wires with their telegraph poles. This was done by making a loop in the wire and putting it over the spike and raising the pole to a perpendicular position. At intervals, the wire would be attached to trees or some other permanent object, so that one pole was sufficient at a place. In the absence of such a support, 2 poles would have to be used at intervals, placed at an angle so as to hold the wire firm in its place. While this was being done, the telegraph wagons would take their positions near where the headquarters they belonged to were to be established, and would connect with the wire. Thus, in a few minutes longer time than it took a mule to walk the length of its coil, telegraphic communication would be effected between all the headquarters of the army. No orders ever had to be given to establish the telegraph. The signal service was used on the march. The men composing this corps were assigned to specified commands. When movements were made, they would go in advance, or on the flanks, and seize upon high points of ground, giving a commanding view of the country, if cleared, or would climb tall trees on the highest points if not cleared, and would denote by signals the positions of different parts of our own army and often the movements of the enemy. They would also take off the signals of the enemy and transmit them. It would sometimes take too long a time to make translations of intercepted dispatches for us to receive any benefit from them, but sometimes they gave useful information. On the afternoon of the 7th, I received news from Washington announcing that Sherman had probably attacked Johnston that day, and that Butler had reached City Point safely and taken it by surprise on the 5th. I had given orders for a movement by the left flank, fearing that Lee might move rapidly to Richmond to crush Butler before I could get there. My order for this movement was as follows. Make all preparations during the day for a night march to take position at Spotsylvania CH with one Army Corps, at Todd's Tavern with one, and another near the intersection of the Piney Branch and Spotsylvania Road with the road from Allsops to Old Courthouse. If this move is made, the trains should be thrown forward early in the morning to the Nye River. I think it would be advisable in making the change to leave Hancock where he is until Warren passes him. He could then follow and become the right of the new line. Burnside will move to Piney Branch Church. Sedgwick can move along the pike to Chancellorsville and on to his destination. Burnside will move on the Plank Road to the intersection of it with the Orange and Fredericksburg Plank Road, then follow Sedgwick to his place of destination. All vehicles should be got out of hearing of the enemy before the troops move, and then move off quietly. It is more than probable that the enemy concentrate for a heavy attack on Hancock this afternoon. In case they do, we must be prepared to resist them and follow up any success we may gain with our whole force. Such a result would necessarily modify these instructions. All the hospitals should be moved today to Chancellorsville. During the 7th, Sheridan had a fight with the rebel cavalry at Todd's Tavern, but routed them, thus opening the way for the troops that were to go by that route at night. Soon after dark, Warren withdrew from the front of the enemy, and was soon followed by Sedgwick. Warren's march carried him immediately behind the works where Hancock's command lay on the Brock Road. With my staff and a small escort of cavalry, I preceded the troops. Meade, with his staff, accompanied me. The greatest enthusiasm was manifested by Hancock's men as we passed by. No doubt it was inspired by the fact that the movement was south. It indicated to them that they had passed through the beginning of the end in the battle just fought. The cheering was so lusty that the enemy must have taken it for a night attack. At all events, it drew from him a furious fusillade of artillery and musketry, plainly heard but not felt by us. Meade and I rode in advance. We had passed but a little way beyond our left when the road forked. We looked to see, if we could, which road Sheridan had taken with his cavalry during the day. It seemed to be the right-hand one, and accordingly we took it. We had not gone far, however, when Colonel C.B. Comstock of my staff, with the instinct of the engineer, suspecting that we were on a road that would lead us into the lines of the enemy, if he too should be moving, dashed by at a rapid gallop and all alone. In a few minutes he returned and reported that Lee was moving, and that the road we were on would bring us into his lines in a short distance. We returned to the forks of the road, left a man to indicate the right road to the head of Warren's column when it should come up, and continued our journey to Todd's Tavern, where we arrived after midnight. My object in moving to Spotsylvania was twofold. First, I did not want Lee to get back to Richmond in time to attempt to crush Butler before I could get there. Second, I wanted to get between his army and Richmond if possible, and if not, to draw him into the open field. But Lee, by accident, beat us to Spotsylvania. Our wagon trains had been ordered easterly of the roads the troops were to march upon before the movement commenced. Lee interpreted this as a semi-retreat of the Army of the Potomac to Fredericksburg, and so informed his government. Accordingly, he ordered Longstreet's corps, now commanded by Anderson, to move in the morning, the 8th, to Spotsylvania. But the woods being still on fire, Anderson could not go into bivouac, and marched directly on to his destination that night. By this accident, Lee got possession of Spotsylvania. It is impossible to say now what would have been the result if Lee's orders had been obeyed as given. But it is certain that we would have been in Spotsylvania and between him and his capital. My belief is that there would have been a race between the two armies to see which could reach Richmond first, and the Army of the Potomac would have had the shorter line. Thus, twice since crossing the Rapidan, we came near closing the campaign, so far as battles were concerned, from the Rapidan to the James River or Richmond. The first failure was caused by our not following up the success gained over Hill's corps on the morning of the 6th, as before described. The second when fires caused by that battle drove Anderson to make a march during the night of the 7th-8th, which he was ordered to commence on the morning of the 8th. But accident often decides the fate of battle. Sheridan's cavalry had had considerable fighting during the afternoon of the 7th, lasting at Todd's Tavern until after night, with the field his at the close. He issued the necessary orders for seizing Spotsylvania and holding the bridge over the Po River, which Lee's troops would have to cross to get to Spotsylvania. But Meade changed Sheridan's orders to Merritt, who was holding the bridge, on his arrival at Todd's Tavern, and thereby left the road free for Anderson when he came up. Wilson, who was ordered to seize the town, did so with his division of cavalry, but he could not hold it against the Confederate corps which had not been detained at the crossing of the Po, as it would have been but for the unfortunate change in Merritt's orders. Had he been permitted to execute the orders Sheridan gave him, he would have been guarding with 2 brigades of cavalry the bridge over the Po River which Anderson had to cross, and must have detained him long enough to enable Warren to reinforce Wilson and hold the town. Anderson soon entrenched himself, if indeed the entrenchments were not already made, immediately across Warren's front. Warren was not aware of his presence, but probably supposed it was the cavalry which Merritt had engaged earlier in the day. He assaulted at once, but was repulsed. He soon organized his men, as they were not pursued by the enemy, and made a second attack, this time with his whole corps. This time he succeeded in gaining a position immediately in the enemy's front, where he entrenched. His right and left divisions, the former Crawford's, the latter Wadsworth's, now commanded by Cutler, drove the enemy back some distance. At this time my headquarters had been advanced to Piney Branch Church. I was anxious to crush Anderson before Lee could get a force to his support. To this end, Sedgwick, who was at Piney Branch Church, was ordered to Warren's support. Hancock, who was at Todd's Tavern, was notified of Warren's engagement and was directed to be in readiness to come up. Burnside, who was with the wagon trains at Aldrich's on our extreme left, received the same instructions. Sedgwick was slow in getting up for some reason, probably unavoidable because he was never at fault when serious work was to be done, so that it was near night before the combined forces were ready to attack. Even then, all of Sedgwick's command did not get into the engagement. Warren led the last assault, 1 division at a time, and of course, it failed. Warren's difficulty was twofold. When he received an order to do anything, it would at once occur to his mind how all the balance of the army should be engaged so as properly to cooperate with him. His ideas were generally good, but he would forget that the person giving him orders had thought of others at the time he had of him. In like manner, when he did get ready to execute an order, after giving most intelligent instructions to division commanders, he would go in with 1 division, holding the others in reserve until he could superintend their movements in person also, forgetting that division commanders could execute an order without his presence. His difficulty was constitutional and beyond his control. He was an officer of superior ability, quick perceptions, and personal courage to accomplish anything that could be done with a small command. Lee had ordered Hill's corps, now commanded by Early, to move by the very road we had marched upon. This shows that even early in the morning of the 8th, Lee had not yet become acquainted with my move, but still thought that the Army of the Potomac had gone to Fredericksburg. Indeed, he informed the authorities at Richmond that he had possession of Spotsylvania and was thus on my flank. Anderson was in possession of Spotsylvania, through no foresight of Lee, however. Early only found that he had been following us when he ran against Hancock at Todd's Tavern. His coming detained Hancock from the battlefield of Spotsylvania for that day, but he, in like manner, kept Early back and forced him to move by another route. Had I ordered the movement for the night of the 7th by my left flank, it would have put Hancock in the lead. It would also have given us an hour or more earlier start. It took all that time for Warren to get the head of his column to the left of Hancock after he had got his troops out of their line confronting the enemy. This hour, and Hancock's capacity to use his whole force when necessary, would no doubt have enabled him to crush Anderson before he could be reinforced. But the movement made was tactical, It kept the troops in mass against a possible assault by the enemy. Our left occupied its entrenchments while the 2 corps to the right passed. If an attack had been made by the enemy, he would have found the 2D Corps in position, fortified, and, practically, the 5th and 6th Corps in position as reserves until his entire front was passed. By a left flank movement, the army would have been scattered while still passing the front of the enemy, and before the extreme right had got by, it would have been very much exposed. Then, too, I had not yet learned the special qualifications of the different corps commanders. At that time, my judgment was that Warren was the man I would suggest to succeed, Meade should anything happen to that gallant soldier to take him from the field. As I have before said, Warren was a gallant soldier, an able man, and he was beside thoroughly imbued with the solemnity and importance of the duty he had to perform. Chapter 52. Battle of Spotsylvania, Hancock's position, assault of Warren's and Wright's corps, Upton promoted on the field, good news from Butler and Sheridan. The Mattapony River is formed by the junction of the Mat, the Tar, the Po, and the Knee rivers, the last being the northernmost of the 4. It takes its rise about a mile south and a little east of the Wilderness Tavern. The Po rises southwest of the same place, but farther away. Spotsylvania is on the ridge dividing these 2 streams, and where they are but a few miles apart. The Brock Road reaches Spotsylvania without crossing either of these streams. Lee's army coming up by the Catharpin Road had to cross the Po at Wooden Bridge. Warren and Hancock came by the Brock Road. Sedgwick crossed the Nye at Catharpin Furnace. Burnside, coming by Aldrich's to Gates's house, had to cross the Knee near the enemy. He found pickets at the bridge, but they were soon driven off by a brigade of Wilcox's division, and the stream was crossed. This brigade was furiously attacked, but the remainder of the division coming up, they were enabled to hold their position and soon fortified it. About the time I received the news of this attack, word came from Hancock that Early had left his front. He had been forced over to the Catharpin Road, crossing the Po at Corbin's and again at Wooden Bridge. These are the bridges Sheridan had given orders to his cavalry to occupy on the 8th, while 1 division should occupy Spotsylvania. These movements of the enemy gave me the idea that Lee was about to make the attempt to get to, or towards, Fredericksburg to cut off my supplies. I made arrangements to attack his right and get between him and Richmond if he should try to execute this design. If he had any such intention, it was abandoned as soon as Burnside was established south of the Neutier. The Po and the Noye are narrow little streams, but deep with abrupt banks, and bordered by heavily wooded and marshy bottoms, at the time we were there, and difficult to cross except where bridged. The country about was generally heavily timbered, but with occasional clearings. It was a much better country to conduct a defensive campaign in than an offensive one. By noon of the 9th, the position of the 2 armies was as follows. Lee occupied a semicircle facing north, northwest, and northeast, enclosing the town. Anderson was on his left, extending to the Po. Ewell came next, then Early. Warren occupied our right, covering the Brock and other roads converging at Spotsylvania. Sedgwick was to his left, and Burnside on our extreme left. Hancock was yet back at Todd's Tavern, but as soon as it was known that Early had left Hancock's front, the latter was ordered up to Warren's right. He formed a line with 3 divisions on the hill overlooking the Po early in the afternoon, and was ordered to cross the Po and get on the enemy's flank. The 4th Division of Hancock's corps, Mott commanding, was left at Todd's when the corps first came up, but in the afternoon it was brought up and placed to the left of Sedgwick's, now Wright's, 6th Corps. In the morning, General Sedgwick had been killed near the right of his entrenchments by rebel sharpshooters. His loss was a severe one to the Army of the Potomac and to the nation. General H.G. Wright succeeded him in the command of his corps. Hancock was now, at 9 p.m. of the 9th of May, across the left flank of Lee's army, but separated from it, and also from the remainder of Meade's army by the Po River. But for the lateness of the hour and the darkness of the night, he would have attempted to cross the river again at Wooden Bridge, thus bringing himself on the same side with both friend and foe. The Po, at the points where Hancock's corps crossed, runs nearly due east. Just below his lower crossing, the troops crossed at 3 points, it turns due south, and after passing under Wooden Bridge, soon resumes a more easterly direction. During the night, this corps built 3 bridges over the Po, but these were in rear. The position assumed by Hancock's corps forced Lee to reinforce his left during the night. Accordingly, on the morning of the 10th, when Hancock renewed his effort to get over the Po to his front, he found himself confronted by some of Early's command, which had been brought from the extreme right of the enemy during the night. He succeeded in effecting a crossing with 1 brigade, however, but finding the enemy entrenched in his front, no more were crossed. Hancock reconnoitred his front on the morning of the 10th with the view of forcing a crossing if it was found that an advantage could be gained. The enemy was found strongly entrenched on the high ground overlooking the river and commanding the Wooden Bridge with artillery. Anderson's left rested on the Po, where it turns south. Therefore, for Hancock to cross over, although it would bring him to the same side of the stream with the rest of the army, would still farther isolate him from it. The stream would have to be crossed twice in the face of the enemy to unite with the main body. The idea of crossing was therefore abandoned. Lee had weakened the other parts of his line to meet this movement of Hancock's, and I determined to take advantage of it. Accordingly, in the morning, orders were issued for an attack in the afternoon on the centre by Warren's and Wright's corps, Hancock to command all the attacking force. 2 of his divisions were brought to the north side of the Po. Gibbon was placed to the right of Warren, and Birney in his rear as a reserve. Barlow's division was left south of the stream, and Mott of the same corps was still to the left of Wright's corps. Burnside was ordered to reconnoitre his front in force, and, if an opportunity presented, to attack with vigour. The enemy, seeing Barlow's division isolated from the rest of the army, came out and attacked with fury. Barlow repulsed the assault with great slaughter and with considerable loss to himself, but the enemy reorganized and renewed the assault. Birney was now moved to the high ground overlooking the river crossings built by our troops and covered the crossings. The second assault was repulsed, again with severe loss to the enemy, and Barlow was withdrawn without further molestation. General T.G. Stevenson was killed in this move. Between the lines, where Warren's assault was to take place, there was a ravine grown up with large trees and underbrush, making it almost impenetrable by man. The slopes on both sides were also covered with a heavy growth of timber. Warren, before noon, reconnoitred his front twice, the first time with 1 and the second with 2 divisions. He was repulsed on both occasions, but gained such information of the ground as to induce him to report recommending the assault.